Hi, Tubile, are you hearing me?
Yes, I can hear you. There's again.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you. There's again. We're about to start now. Morning, everyone, and welcome. I am now going to do our house rules, and I will hand over quickly to Prof. Sylvester Mpandeli. I will record, and then we are also live on YouTube. So I'm going to share my screen for our house rules slide. Morning once again, and welcome to our WRC webinar, Dialogue on a Decade of Research on Water Use of Underutilized Indigenous and Traditional Crops. Housekeeping items: request that delegates only make use of the video function when speaking. Remember to look at the camera, not at the screen. Mute your mic if you are not speaking. Use the chat to post questions or raise your hand to share ideas or engage in our dialogue. Wait for the facilitator to call on you or to unmute your mic. Let's minimize this. Presentations will be made available after the event, but we'll have to get consent from all speakers first. So this is how you access the webinar Q&A. At the bottom of your screens, you should see the icon says participants, and the next one is Q&A. So we request that people use that, posting any questions related to our dialogue. Any of our panelist members will respond to that. They will either type in live. If the time allows, then they can respond to it. Maybe the facilitators will just give them time and then respond live. If we don't have time, but they will just respond by typing those questions while the webinar is going ahead. And then the other one is the chat. I've already started greeting everyone and welcoming everyone. So we can use that one to also carry on engaging. I saw someone was asking about the program. I'm now going to share the program. Here's a program for the day. I'm just gonna pause for like 1 minute so that people can look at it before I then hand over to our facilitator, Professor Sylvester Mpandeli. I think 1 minute is up. I will now hand over to you, Prof. Thank you. Stop sharing. Prof, over to you.
Yes. Thank you, Tobile. Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to this webinar or seminar event. And the purpose of this event is a decade of research on water use of underutilized indigenous and traditional crops. My name is Sylvester Mpandeli. I'm from the Water Research Commission. I'm an executive manager responsible for the water utilization in agriculture portfolio. And some of you are aware that, we've been working together on this focus area for the past 10 to 15 years. And this is work in progress. We've been doing this with our key strategic partners. And I'm happy to see, a very good, team of experts that's going to share their ideas, with us. And the purpose of this, maybe let me just give, sort of a quick overview, is to make sure that, we start promoting our indigenous crops or traditional crops. And we have been doing this across the country. And we have built a very strong foundation and as an organization with our partners, because the whole idea is to make sure that, we address issues related to food security and the fact that, we are facing multi-stresses in this country, including, water scarcity. So we have got the responsibility to make sure that, we derive this focus area. And over and above that, it's gonna be one of our new 8 focus areas. And we're gonna use some of the results generated from these indigenous or traditional crops for the demonstration sites that we have identified as Water Research Commission. So just in brief, I wanted to share this with you, and you have got a program, that was circulated by Tobile, and I'm happy to welcome our CEO, Desgen Naidu, Prof. Modi, Dr. Melvin Yati, Dr. Vimbai Chumonyo, Richard Kunz. And for your information, colleagues, and I must apologize in advance. I'm going to chair this session for the first 45 minutes, and then from there, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Tafazo Mabaudi due to the fact that I need to chair the final project meeting at 10 o'clock. This meeting was supposed to be chaired by one of my managers. Unfortunately, she has got an appointment with the doctor. So without wasting much time, let me ask our CEO to just, give us a keynote address, and then from there, we'll take Prof. Modi from University of KwaZulu-Natal. Over to you, Desige.
Thank you very much, Sylvester, and good morning, colleagues. I hope you can hear me. I had to go in and out a few times before I got the audio, so just shout if you can't. This year is quite a significant one for many reasons, some of which I will talk to you in my presentation shortly. But for the WRC itself, this is its 50th year of existence. So the WRC has a birthday this year. And as part of that, we are celebrating through a series of events, including this one, the achievements, not just of an institution. The institution itself is 50 years old, but the institution recognizes that what it really does is it coordinates the activities of a community of practice in this country. And the water science, technology, and innovation community of practice has been incredibly productive over all of that time and will be continuously productive into the future. But this 10-year milestone, this decade of research into indigenous and traditional crops is well worth celebrating. The achievements have been, I think, quite prolific. I think they're instructive about how we can go into the future, not only in the agriculture domain, but influencing that much larger ecosystem that relates to food security and relates very directly to the SDGs that we are chasing to 2030. So colleagues, you've got a terrific lineup of speakers with very, very high levels of expertise and are respected not only locally, but globally. They are truly global leaders in this domain. So I'm going to offer you a presentation on context. So I'm going to be putting up my slide. And I hope you can see that. And I want to talk to indigenous foods and traditional foods being a key to multiple securities.
Sorry, Des, your slide is not showing yet. If you can reload it again.
So I have to go out and come again.
No, your slide.
Right, yeah, that's what, okay.
Yeah,
let me try that again.
Share
Screen. Okay, I see the problem. Just give me 1 second.
All right.
I think I closed too many things when I was doing what I was doing.
No
Okay,
worries.
it should work now. Oops. Let me do that again. Apologize for this. I tested it before and it worked really fine. Here we go. Can you see it now?
Oh, yes. Yeah,
yes,
we
you
have.
can see it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can put it on full screen, and here we go. So I was saying that what I really want to examine is how indigenous and traditional foods are actually a key to multiple securities as we sit here at the beginning of the first year of the third decade of the third millennium. I think this is a very important space and time. Now, one of the things that we've been reminded about in the 2020 year is that although we have been overwhelmed by an infectious disease, by the Culvert pandemic, that has penetrated every single aspect of human society, every single aspect of the way we are used to living. The thing that it had masked in that, and the Secretary General of the UN, when he delivered his Mandela lecture in July last year, not only brought this to the fore, but he has been repeating this theme continuously since then. That the underlying pandemic that we are in fact engaging in the world today is the one of inequality. And that we need a new social compact for this new era as we go forward. And this in turn has advised a number of things because firstly, it has found its place in what last year I was calling the four horses of the apocalypse. That yes, indeed, there is a COVID-19 epidemic. I was hopeful, like you were hopeful, that by the time we sat down together in 2021, we would talk about this as an aspect of the past. I think it is quite clear to everybody that the pandemic is going to be with us for a while. And like other places, have engaged a third wave, this is more than just a possibility for a place like South Africa. And so it's not a temporary matter. It is a matter that will be with us for a while and will change very fundamentally, even post-pandemic, the way we do many, many things. And hopefully in the way we're engaging that and conceptualizing this post-COVID world, we will be able to do it in a way that tackles the big perennial crises that have been with us at least for the past decade, some much longer than that. The major one is the climate crisis. So the big changes that happened in the White House earlier this year are hugely significant for this. The second is the issue around a broken multilateral system. Many people are lamenting this. Many people are starting to read obituaries to the multilateral system. But what we are seeing in the response to this epidemic is the possibility of new global formulae that are coming to the fore around a new model for globalization, if you like. And the other thing that we have to tackle is the notion of the economic crisis. And it really is a crisis in the world. And one of the things that we have to worry about is that as the world is getting to grips in a more graphic way around the pandemic, the IMF has updated its forecast on the economic outlook, and most of the world has now a more positive economic outlook than it had before. Unfortunately, South Africa is not one of those places. And I want to remind you that the whole notion of food security, the whole notion of how we engage the environment and agriculture has been used as an example of one of the key culprits in the domain of climate change, how we engage the global system of the flow of funds and food security status in the world through the international trading system are all fundamental issues that we have to tackle, including what the building blocks of an economy will need to be on the back of that. And I think that indigenous and traditional foods have a very important role to play in that domain. So January was prolific. You know, we were distracted all over the world by what happened on January the 6th in the Capitol buildings in Washington with the invasion of Parliament and Senate by a group of renegades, really. But that masked something much bigger that was going on behind that. I mean, first was that put a particular texture around the change in the guard in the White House itself. And I think it may have contributed more positively to that than they had envisaged. And alongside that came a new declaration of a United States embracing the possibility of being in the world again. But two other very big events happened in January this year that I think we should ponder on. The first is the Climate Adaptation Summit, which began on the 25th of January, where 22 heads of state, 50 ministers and leaders from business, from civil society, from environmental organizations, from organized labor, all got together to engage the notion of adaptation in the context of the climate change debate and pushing an emphasis towards adaptation something South Africa and Africa has been pushing for quite a long time in isolation. And we were blunted in all of these efforts in the last 20 years because the conversation was dominated by the North, in particular Europe, around mitigation. And one of the appeals that was made in that climate adaptation conference was a shifting of funds, where the Secretary General, who I referred to before, has said that 50% of the funding that's available in the climate finance package should in fact be invested in adaptation activities. I think this has important implications for agriculture as a whole, but perhaps indigenous and traditional crops in particular. The second thing that happened in January, and it started a day after that, was the World Economic Forum. This was the virtual setting of the World Economic Forum. Its physical setting will happen later this year in May in Singapore. So not Davos anymore. And one of the big things that came out of the World Economic Forum this year, apart from the notion of stakeholder capitalization, was this notion of the Great Reset. The leadership that was gathered there, and there were many more this year than there have been before because it was now a virtual engagement, so many more people could in fact listen in and participate. They all embraced this notion that, one, we have to admit that the pathway that we have been on for at least the past 20 years, I would argue for the past 300 years, has been on a very destructive pathway. It has yielded much more wealth in the system, but wealth in the form of more money, not in terms of the well-being that we were looking for and that we had very clearly enunciated as a global community in the World Summit for Sustainable Development in 2002. In fact, when Klaus Schwab was introducing this concept, he talked about 4 Ps. And 3 of those Ps come directly from WSSD 2002 Johannesburg. And that we have to organize for a new monitoring and evaluation framework for the way we're doing things around building the socioeconomic mechanism of the world on the basis of what does it do for the planet? Does it have impact on our prosperity? And are we sufficiently looking at people? And this was the mantra of WSSD, people, planet, prosperity. He also added a 4th one and said that our governance mechanisms in the world need a lot of work. So the principles of what constitutes good governance needs to be the 4th P. And if anyone is seeing the resemblance of 4 Ps there and what's in the WRC strategy, maybe it's a complete coincidence. Maybe Klaus Schwab has been reading our strategic plan. But colleagues, let us see what this great reset actually entails. So the first couple of bubbles are the ones that we've been talking about intensely last year. And for some of it, quite intensely before that. So the whole notion of health futures is absolute. We have realized that in the 21st century, in this, the 3rd millennium that we are counting, and of course there were many millennia before that we were recording less diligently, we are still in a place in the world where a retrovirus can take over the world. It's an impossibly difficult place to be. However, the bigger picture around that is that behind our inability to respond adequately to the COVID crisis, we have had a large expose on the vulnerability of the health systems of the world everywhere, with very, very, very few exceptions. So our health futures is an absolutely enormous part of the Great Reset. The second component that was emphasized was this issue that we need to get beyond the geopolitics. Now, I don't agree with that. I think geopolitics are a permanent phenomenon. And I think one of the failures that we have as practitioners in just about every field is that we continuously ignore the geopolitics. But I think it is true to say that there's going to be a massive change in the geopolitics going into the future. So in the domain of moving into a dominance of renewable energy, the current geopolitical map, which is based on fossil fuels, changes quite radically. And IRENA, the Institute for Renewable Energy, that's based in Saudi Arabia, this global organization, in fact, put together a commission to examine the geopolitics of renewable energy and what it means around changing where we are in the world today. And I think that's crucially important. And one of the important aspects around that renewable energy debate, of course, like in the health debate, nutritional security is absolute. In the energy debate around this new geopolitical system, the whole debate around food for energy becomes an incredibly important part of that debate. Then there is the issue of the future of work. We all know this. 2 years ago, we'd have been sitting in a very comfortable room somewhere, either at the WRC or some conference center with the opportunity to engage much more robustly with one another. We now have to get used to the fact that we're all sitting behind a screen, but it's starting to work. We're learning how to work this thing. We're actually finding many opportunities in it. And the issue of the future of work is an important part of that debate. But if we go further than that, the other bubbles that become important in the Great Reset are the issues around developing fairer economies. Because one of the difficulties in the world today is that the world's Lorenz curve looks a lot worse than it did before. What I'm talking about is the Gini coefficient, because we are moving into a space where increasingly, in a snowballing way, fewer and fewer people in the world as a percentage of the global population are in fact owning more and more of the wealth of the world. And there are numbers all over the place. You know these numbers very well. And so the whole notion of developing fairer economies in line with what Antonio Guterres talked about around dealing with the pandemic of inequality becomes paramount. But a core component of that are better ways of doing business. And one of the things that is crucially important in these domains is around greater inclusion. And the agriculture sector has to be one of those places that can demonstrate what inclusion actually can mean. Because we have gone from a generally included economic model with first level agriculture from a long, long time ago into one that started moving into the first level of a particular model of commercialization, including the whole slavery paradigm, I must add, inside that. And we've gone fairly far to the right. And we're struggling to work out how to start moving a little bit more to the center, maybe even more to the left, if it's possible. And we're getting stuck on the value chains of the current dominant crop types that we use in the world, because their global value chains are actually embedded in this inequality economy. So one of the promises from indigenous and traditional crops is because they're not already inside that model, a new model can develop around them that gives us a much better possibility. And then if we add to this the whole issue of environmental sustainability, which is absolutely paramount, and here the resonance between indigenous and traditional crops and the climate agenda becomes something that we have been talking about for a while, we've been examining for a while, you have been researching for a while, and you've been talking about it. And there's a great positivity associated with that, as is the possibility of being one of the drivers around technology for good. So colleagues, the whole notion of what we're getting out of the Great Reset is saying that agriculture specifically can make a very important push to realize many of these goals, or at least push us a lot further towards those goals. And within that, there is a very particular opportunity associated with indigenous and traditional crops in that domain. So let me move a little bit further and say that one of the things that we know, and we've been saying as a water community of practice for a long time, is that the whole notion of water scarcity, and scarcity not only defined by droughts, but also defined by lower water availability in extreme weathers of all kinds, there is as much water available in a drought as there is in a flood. That means it's scarce in both arenas. And we're seeing this right now. I mean, we're seeing in the United States, in Texas, in the middle of massive snowstorms and blizzards, which means lots of frozen water all over the place, you have an absolute water scarcity inside the system. It's almost day zero in parts of Texas right now. So the whole thing about extreme weather, which continues to dominate the global risk register, is something that we do know. But there are some debates around that we have to engage. One of those debates is this one, where continuously the mantra in the world is that, one, agriculture is the biggest user of water, the greatest allocations of water in the world as a whole. And globally, currently, 70% of fresh water is used in the agricultural enterprise. Now, I know you have a good argument to say that out of that 70%, a very, very small percentage is actually consumed by the agricultural exercise, and a lot of that actually moves out back into the system. This is true, but we need to engage that. The other thing that we're talking about in the South African environment, we're saying on the one hand, we use less than 70%, we use 61%, but on the other hand, and this came up in the summit that Minister Sisulu had with the agricultural sector leadership a few weeks ago, where this was bounced up, that you're using 61% of the water, but you're only accounting for a 2% contribution to the GDP. So agriculture, in the wake of water scarcity, becomes an automatic target. And I think one of the problems is that agriculture has not made its case around the water issue, and that's something we have to engage. But let me quickly talk about indigenous crops and how they feed into this overall framework before giving way to Albert. So indigenous crops have a number of serious attractors in the system. And as I said before, the work that we've been doing as a community of practice in South Africa, that you've been doing, has created a lot of the case, as has the international community of practice around this. And many of you are not just connected to that international community of practice, some of you are even leaders in that international community of practice, which is truly excellent. So in the domain of the nexus, for example, this part of the world must rank around the top 3 or 4 hotspots in the world around producing new knowledge in that domain. But let's see what this is about. Okay, one of the things that we paid a lot of attention to is to see whether or not we are looking at the possibility of indigenous crops being much more water smart than the exotic crops that currently dominate the commercial agriculture landscape. The conclusion of all of those studies, with no exceptions, is that indigenous crops offer a very good prospect. In fact, the headline of the value proposition for indigenous and traditional crops is that they are, in general, water smart. This is not related to how you perform the agriculture and what kind of irrigation methods you use and the like. This is talking about whether or not indigenous crops are a smarter, in the water sense, pump in the system as compared to their exotic counterparts, and that part has been backed. But the other question that arose with all of this is, well, okay, it's good to be water smart, but what about nutritional value? And the projects that we have seen in the South African landscape as part of Sylvester and his team's portfolio and beyond that, of course, is that we're not only meeting the nutritional equivalent of exotic crops, in many, many cases, indigenous crops are superseding the nutritional value of the commercial crops. And this is a very, very important part of the equation. If you add to that in general, there is a higher level of resilience, so it can manage the more extreme weathers better than their exotic cousins. And in the domain of climate change, this becomes crucially important. Not just climate change as a long-term prospect, but the very local prospect of extreme weather events, we are seeing that there's an environmental friendliness associated with this as well. Now, some may argue, simply because indigenous and traditional crops are not in the traditional commercialization model, that they are now environmentally sensitive. When they get into that traditional commercialization model, you will have a problem. But here's the thing, we don't have to go into that traditional commercialization model. In fact, indigenous and traditional crops can redefine what the commercialization model can be so that it still meets all of those parameters. The second to last point is that indigenous crops in general have a much better opportunity for being inclusive, socially inclusive, societally inclusive, even economically inclusive. And that's because of their genesis. They come from very localized areas. Those localized areas have developed very inclusive social systems around how that farming enterprise happens, how the distribution happens, how the limited commercialization around this happens currently. But you know what you have there is the DNA of a new commercialization model. If you say that these are the performance indicators that are paramount to us, then this is the direction in which one can go. And we've got great examples of this. Some of the examples have concentrated on the crops themselves. Some of them have not, but have a strong relationship with the crops and are elements of that new commercialization model. And I'm just highlighting one here. And this is the multi-use water systems that we have developed. These are incredible, absolutely incredible. So if you package what you're able to do with the indigenous crops, together with the right kind of water delivery model, together with the right kind of retail model, then you have the possibility of developing a very important new segment to the agricultural sector as a whole, but a way to transform that agriculture sector. And agriculture in turn will have an influence around organizing to do the better business and attain the fairer economies that the Great Reset is talking about. The very last point that I want to make is that we are looking at climate smart systems. We are looking very, very piercingly at possibilities in a number of sectors. Already in the first meeting of the Presidential Climate Commission, which happened last Friday, this issue has already come up. Do we have candidates that can organize for us to demonstrate what a climate smart economy can be? And agriculture was one of the places that was pointed to. So colleagues, there is a lot to do, but we need to pause now. And well, maybe one last point before that. And it's this one, is that this continent also has a possibility to lead, because this continent can be a global laboratory for the agricultural transformation that we want to see all around the world. We have experienced in many countries on this continent a combination of high growth and resilient growth at that. And we are seeing the development of systems in a very positive way. And I think we should be proud of that. But that final point that I wanted to make was this, is that agriculture presents the possibility on the back of indigenous and traditional crops to be able to introduce a new model into the system, one that is climate smart, one that is water smart, one that is resilient, one that is highly nutritional, and one that has the possibility of genuinely organizing for a much more inclusive economic model. And if we're able to do this, then that template that was put out as a question on the 26th of January of, can we achieve this great reset? We will be able to say, yes, we can, because we have a formula. So colleagues, thank you very, very much for the opportunity to speak to you. And I look forward to the other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Desigan, for sharing this provocative, presentation. We really appreciate that as stakeholders. I don't want to say as Water Research Commission because it will be like it's a dialogue between the two of us. Colleagues, there we go. I mean, we have heard it from Desigan. He has covered several issues. But the most important thing for me, it was the fact that, I mean, he has highlighted the benefits that are coming from these indigenous or traditional crops. And the fact that, I mean, these crops are inclusive, climate smart, water smart, they've got strong resilience and so on. But we're gonna hear more from other experts. I was just informed that Professor Modi is just attending urgent issues. Apparently there is student protest at the university at the moment. We're gonna take, it's either we'll take Dr. Melvin Nyati or Dr. Vimbai Chimonyo. I'm not sure between the two colleagues who is ready or who is gonna take the platform first. Dr. Nyati, are you ready or can I take Dr. Chimonyo?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Prof.
Yes, we can hear you, but
Please take Dr. Chimonyo. I've just logged in. I was struggling to log in.
okay.
Yeah.
But did you manage to connect?
Yes, I managed to connect.
Okay, okay. If that is the case, please go ahead and show your presentation. And colleagues, maybe before I say bye-bye to you, my apologies once again, because I need to go and share the final meeting. Professor Mabaudi is gonna take over immediately after Dr. Chimonyo's presentation. Thank you. Go on, Doc.
Yeah, Vimbai, you can go ahead and share your screen. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Just to confirm, can you all hear and also see my screen?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share information on the work that we've been doing with the WRC on water use of underutilized indigenous crops. My focus will be on cereal and legume crops. Just as an introduction and not wanting to take away the points emphasized by Desigan. So for South Africa, it comprises more than 91% of arid and semi-arid regions. And these areas are projected to increase due to climate change. What is of interest is that many of the marginalized production systems where resource-poor farmers reside are rain-fed, and they use agriculture as one of their livelihood strategies. Within the same communities, there is a high prevalence of food and nutrition insecurity and also poverty. Maize is the dominant cropping system. However, this is highly prone to the instance of drought, which if you look at the statistics and the figures that are presented, you'd find South Africa is experiencing severe droughts on more than 80% of its land. So yes, cereals are the dominant, rather maize is the dominant crop grown in many of these marginalized cropping systems. But then at the end of the day, the importance of cereals within human diets can never be overlooked. It is the main source of dietary energy, and you'd find across Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of the farmers rely on it for an income, for feeding livestock, and also for trade. The widely cultivated cereals in Sub-Saharan Africa include, but not limited to, maize, sorghum, millet, and wheat. But you'd find that when you look at the projections, climate change projections, cereal production is set to decrease by 3.2%, and more so for wheat and maize. So a lot of the talk has been, what do we do to mitigate the effects of climate change, to make sure that individuals residing in marginal areas and those resource-poor farmers can at least adapt to the impact. And one thing that has been on the table for the longest of time is the use of legumes to mitigate against climate change. So legumes contribute to 27% of the primary crops produced. And they are a rich source of protein, and also are desired in low resource or poor resource farming communities, because they fix nitrogen and increase the biodiversity or functional biodiversity within the production systems. Major legumes in Africa include cowpea, chickpea, groundnut, faba bean, pigeon pea, and soya bean. If we come closer to home here in South Africa, you find that common bean is one of our main legumes that is produced and consumed. However, it is apparent that there is 78,000 ton deficit from what we produce and what we consume. So there is definitely need to bridge that gap, but also looking at it from the perspective of supporting cropping systems. There is need to diversify our cropping systems, which are cereal-based, by incorporating more cereals and also legumes. So there is that need to then look at alternative crop species, one, to enhance adaptation, also to increase food and nutrition security. So one way of doing this is by using alternative crop species that we have since designated as underutilized, neglected and underutilized crop species. So why neglected and underutilized crop species, or underutilized indigenous traditional crop species? As Desikan alluded to and also emphasized, they are central to climate change adaptation, and they are front runners to mitigate the impacts of drought, especially in low input, low output production systems. They enhance crop diversity and therefore support ecosystem services. And they have several nutraceutical and pharmaceutical properties. They strengthen local food system, therefore speak to strengthening households that do not have the resources to be more resilient against perturbation. And they also contribute to the water, food, nutrition, and health nexus. So we have an array of cereal and legume crops that are at our disposal, but you find that in South Africa, there are only a handful of cereal crops and legume crops that are actually produced. And if you notice on the table on your left that I have presented, all those that have an asterisk are those that appear on the FAO statistics database. Those that are underlined have been designated as priority underutilized crop species for South Africa. Coming back to the context of, can underutilized crop species therefore address issues of adaptation under low water availability? Also, do they actually use less water than nationally important crops? The WRC, together with several researchers and also here at UKZN, have asked two important questions that the following slides will try and address. The first one being, are underutilized cereal and legume crop species actually drought tolerant? And the second one is, do they use less water than the commercially important crops? So for the benefit of those that might not be familiar with some of the terms. So when we speak about crop watering, we're talking about into the system, and for calculating it, it's your rainfall minus your runoff, deep percolation, and if you have specialized instruments, one can go far as calculating the capillary rise and changes in subflow and also water content. Water use efficiency is calculated as biomass or the economic yield over crop water use. We also have terms like transpiration efficiency and irrigation efficiency. Another term that I would want everyone to keep in the back of their head is nutritional yield and nutritional content, because beyond water use, we're looking at the outcomes of the initiative. We can improve water use. To what extent? There is also need for us to also improve our nutrition. So the main findings that are going to be presented in this presentation are coming from three reports that were submitted to the WRC. The first one being water use, drought tolerance of selected traditional crops that was submitted in 2013 by Prof. Modi and Prof. Tafaz Mamabaudi. The second one, determining water use of indigenous grain and legume food crops. And then the last one being water use of crops and nutritional water productivity of food production, nutrition, and health in rural communities in KZN. So this has been spanning from as far back as 2000 when the projects have been awarded, all through to 2020, and recently several other projects that are currently underway. So for the first project, which is water use, drought tolerance or selected traditional crops, the main focus would be pearl millet and maize for the cereal, and Bambara groundnut and cowpea for the legume. The second report, maize and sorghum for the cereal, also Bambara groundnut and cowpea, similar in the last report. So to answer the question, are underutilized crops is mainly cereal and legumes actually drought? So you find when researching on maize, results showed that whilst it was low yielding when compared to the commercial hybrids, the landrace exhibited drought tolerance during early establishment. For sorghum, there were no significant differences in grain yield and other growth parameters across commercial varieties and landrace varieties. In pearl millet, where water stress did not limit the production of pearl millet, when grown under rain-fed condition, the yield was similar to that of irrigated crops. So the main mechanisms that were used to then enhance drought tolerance or to show drought tolerance is that there was a phenological flexibility, early establishment. You'd find that there was a reduced surface by producing smaller and thicker leaves, a reduction in the canopy size. And in another of the reports, they showcased that there was an increase in the root to shoot ratio. You'd find there was a maintenance of tedger pressure due to osmotic adjustment, and there was a reduction of chlorophyll content, which reduced oxidative damage on the photosynthetic parameters. Within legumes, for the two legumes that have been investigated, that's cowpea and bambara, you find that cowpea actually performed better under rain-fed conditions than irrigated. Whilst in bambara, whilst there was a reduction in yield due to a reduction in water, the magnitude across seed coat color, which was one of the variables that was being tested, was different, with the darker seed coat colors exhibiting a higher drought tolerance or less magnitude to yield reduction than the lighter seed color. Yield penalties were less than those compared to dry bean and groundnut, which were used as the commercial comparison. So for the cowpea and the Bambara groundnut, the main mechanisms used for drought tolerance were also phenological flexibility, producing smaller and thicker leaves, stomatal control, which is one of the main mechanisms used by Bambara groundnut. Also an adjustment of turgor pressure and also reduction of chlorophyll content. So one can conclude that yes, indeed, taking words from this again, these underutilized crop species under investigation are water smart and do exhibit a degree of drought tolerance. Looking at the second question, water use, do underutilized crop species actually use more or less water than commercially important crop species? In this particular slide, I present to you two tables, one for cereal and the other for legumes. I compare water use, I compare yield, water use, and water use sufficiency from what has been observed in literature and what has been observed by the reports that I have. Overall, you find that yes, water use of a lot of these of the investigated underutilized crop species is less than that of the commercially important crop species, and water use efficiency is comparable for the cereal crops. However, when we look at the legume crops, you find that water use efficiency is much lower than that of commercially important crops, definitely for Bambara, but this is quite debatable for cowpea. Overall, we know that for cereals that are C4 plants, they have a greater efficiency of assimilating carbon. And because of this, they will fix more tea for less water. That's why when we then compare water use efficiency across the species, we have higher water use efficiency in cereals than we do for legumes. Then the wide range of water use and water use efficiency across the different species is attributed to environmental conditions, which obviously were different across the different experiments that were shown in the reports. Also, there was varietal differences and the way water use efficiency was measured. So the question is, given that we need to mainstream some of these crops into existing cropping systems and present figures and data that show that they are quite comparable to commercially important species, one needs to then figure out how do we then create a situation whereby these crops can be taken up or are better appreciated by communities. And one way of doing this is by focusing on the management aspect to try and improve the water use efficiency of underutilized cereal and legume crops. So I have listed a few methods that have been used within or that have been showcased by the reports that I presented. The first being modifying the ecophysiology of the crop through multi-cropping, more importantly, intercropping. So you find that when underutilized crop species are grown as an intercrop, you find the amount of output or the yield increases, and there's a significant reduction in the water consumed by the system. Investing in rainwater harvesting and soil water conservation technologies within the system also reduces the loss of unproductive water and increases overall output. focusing on best management practices like your right fertilizer, spacing, and planting dates has also been shown to improve yields, but has wide impacts or effects on your water use. In some instances, it might increase your water use, but the increase in water use is not at the same rate as your increase in yield, which overall would definitely improve your water use efficiency. Generally, selecting within the selection of underutilized crop species, those that are shown to be more drought tolerant also can improve your yield and reduce your water use efficiency. There's also a need for us to rely on the tools that science has provided for us. For instance, the use of GIS and remote sensing to actually quantify some of the parameters required for the enhancement of water use efficiency, looking at climate impact modeling, so the use of crop simulation models to then determine the best management strategies for improved water use. So just as a way of, I'm getting towards the end of this presentation, and a lot of work has actually emerged from the work that was commenced in 2020, and a lot of it has been published in peer-reviewed articles. And the argument is, we are not here to replace your maize and your soybean, but we are here to offer an alternative for those cropping systems and the individuals within the cropping systems that are unable to cope with perturbation caused by climate change and also by the inavailability of resources. So we are offering underutilized crop species as an alternative and also to complement existing cropping systems. And as a way of conclusion, the question, are underutilized crop, cereal and legume crop species drought tolerant? Yes, indeed, one can say they are drought tolerant to a degree, and they use different mechanisms to achieve this. However, research to map ecophysiology and the genetic responses is still outstanding, and there is need for us to actually look into that. There's also need for us to test the spatial and temporal adaptation of these underutilized crop species so that we can then reach out to more people and offer this as an option. Do underutilized crop species use less water than commercially important species? Yes, overall they do. However, the lower yields may result in lower water use efficiency. Therefore, better batch management strategies are encouraged to then try and find a local solution to improving yields. Alternatively, we need to invest in more in breeding and genetics of these crop species so that they can improve their yielding potential. Then there are other considerations that need to be made. So we've got your nutritional water productivity, which links back to the equation that I had asked all of you to keep in your head. Together with improving water use, there is also need to consider the nutritional yield per drop of water consumed. Then we have your water footprint analysis. So this goes beyond the confines of field and market and considers more of a human-centered approach where we are asking how much water is required for someone to then have access to X amount of food. I would like to acknowledge all the students and authors of the research reports on water use in underutilized, neglected crop species. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imbai. That was a very interesting project. For those of you who might not know, Wimbai actually trained and got a PhD on one of the projects she was speaking on, which was the project on water use of indigenous cereal and legume food crops. So she focused on water use of intercrops and got a PhD from that. So that's also one of the benefits of these projects, the capacity development, and especially when you get to see them still participating in ongoing WRC projects. So thank you very much for that, Vimbai. Next on, we've got Dr. Melvin Nyati. Melvin, are you ready to share your presentation? Melvin? I think Melvin might still be having connectivity challenges. Oh, I see he's there now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Is my presentation visible?
Yes, we can see your presentation. You go to display setting and switch screens. No, where you go into slide mode.
Maybe it's because I'm connected to this. Let me get out. Okay, a moment. Because I'm connected to the.
Melvin, are you still there?
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, you were saying I should go to.
You can share your screen.
Okay. So is it visible now?
Yes, I can see it.
You can see it.
Yeah, that's fine now. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. We had the privilege to be working on this project of nutritional water productivity of traditional crops, which was funded by the Water Research Commission. And I also managed to get my PhD from this study. And these were the colleagues who were working with. I would like to first acknowledge the Agriculture Research Council to be hosting this study, the Water Research Commission as a funder, and Wageningen University where I did my study. So there are just few terminology I would like to explain ahead. I know the term water productivity, it's argued a lot, but in the context of this study, we just mean yield or biomass per volume of water used to produce it. Its units can be kg per cubic meter or kg per hectare per milliliter. So that's the definition of water productivity. Another important terminology is nutritional yield, whereby we thought most people don't present the nutritional yield, and which is very, very important. It combines the knowledge of nutrient composition of crops with that of raw edible leaf yield. So how do you calculate it? Is the portion which you can consume multiplied by the nutrient content. In this case, because it was leafy crops only, it's just the leaves. Its units can be in milligram per hectare or grams per hectare. So, like I mentioned, we're working on nutritional water productivity of crops. This is our main terminology. It combines the knowledge of nutrient composition of crops with that of water productivity, which I had already defined. So how do you calculate it? It's water productivity multiplied by nutrient content. So just for example, in this case, I took one for sweet potato, which has a water productivity of 2.7 kg per cubic meter and iron nutritional content of 0.4 milligram per 100 gram. Its nutritional water productivity will be 10.8 milligram per cubic meter. And what does that really mean? It means that per cubic meter of water used, sweet potato yielded 10.8 milligram of iron. So why are we really interested in water productivity? If we look at our map, South Africa, it's already under high stress, defined as a country with high water stress. And predictions show that these are just predictions from 1990 to 2100. The population will be increasing, which means more people will need more food. So that's why we're interested in water productivity. And if you check again how South Africa is judged in terms of malnutrition, it shows that we are moderate, but we don't want to, that's at the national level, we don't want to get too high. Basically, how this is this thing of malnutrition or hidden hunger, it's a cycle. We all know mothers give birth to us. So if the mother is malnourished, she'll give birth to a child who is with low weight, and the child will also have child growth failure. And this is a cycle which goes back again and again. It keeps repeated. So therefore, malnutrition is irreversible. So we can't continue as business as usual. That's why we did this study on traditional vegetables and why we chose traditional vegetables. There are a lot of claims which have been said by a lot of researchers is that they require less inputs in terms of fertilizer and water. They are highly nutritious in iron and zinc and vitamin A. They can withstand stress to semi-stress arid condition. They can contribute to livelihoods of people, contribute to obesity and diseases. And one of important, they can contribute to economic development in our continent, which is Africa. However, there are several constraints. One of them is the negative mindset of people, because these crops are eaten when there's no other means. So therefore, they are claimed to be poor man's crops. Inadequate research, but I mean, I know KZN and ARC have been trying to close that gap. Lack of quality seeds, value addition technologies, poor marketing, and poor policy frameworks. So these are the constraints why these crops are not marketed, for example, compared to other crops. So our objectives was to assess water productivity, nutritional yield, and nutritional water productivity of the selected traditional crops, which is amaranth, spider flower, and orange flesh sweet potato. We use Swiss chard as a reference crop. How did we do it? We conducted this study under a rain shelter here at ARC Vopi. These are our crops, Cliome, amaranth, Swiss chard, and orange flesh sweet potato. We impose 3 water stress levels, which is 30, 50, and 80. 30% is no water stress, 50% it's moderate water stress, 80% it's severe water stress. We also measured soil water content using the neutron probe, and also determined the nutritional content, which is beta carotene and also iron and zinc. So this table just shows us the results, the nutritional content for both seasons, whereby we conducted this study. Remember, claims are that these crops are highly nutritious. Therefore, we brought Swiss charts to compare, to say this is a crop which has been there for many years and widely utilized, and it's a commercial crop, so it will be wise to compare it with these traditional crops. In terms of iron and zinc and beta carotene concentration, we realize that traditional crops are higher when compared to Swiss chard throughout the season. As much as there were changes, we see that in the first season, sweet potato was higher in iron, and in the second season, we realized that spider flower was higher, and also amaranth does better when it comes to beta carotene concentration. So in terms of nutrient concentration, we realize that these crops are dense compared to Swiss chard. However, we also calculated the nutritional yield, like I mentioned before. For the first season, we realized that they are almost comparable. We see sweet potato retained higher nutritional yield in terms of iron, and Swiss chard higher in terms of zinc, and amaranth higher in terms of beta carotene. However, for the second season, we realized that Swiss chard was higher in terms of nutritional yield for iron and zinc, and amaranth managed to also retain higher nutritional yield in beta carotene. So therefore, generally, one will agree with me that these crops are comparable to Swiss chard when it comes to this nutritional yield, as much as generally they are lower in iron and zinc, but in beta carotene they are higher. We also calculated the nutritional water productivity, and we realized that for the first season, for iron nutritional water productivity, spider flower, iron and zinc spider flower was the highest, whereas for beta carotene, amaranth was the highest, and this is which retained the lowest. And for the second season, Spider flower maintained higher nutritional water productivity in terms of iron and zinc, and amaranth maintained the higher nutritional water productivity in terms of beta carotene. So one will agree with me that in terms of nutritional water productivity, these traditional crops are higher compared to Swiss chard. So my take-home message is that in terms of nutritional content, TLVs are higher when compared to Swiss chard. And one of the challenges which we face is that this nutrient content vary between seasons, and we realize season 1 and season 2, and it also varies between species. However, when we compare how much nutrients you harvest in a season, we realize that Swiss chard is higher compared to TLVs in terms of iron and zinc. Why is that case? Is because it has more edible portion compared to TLVs. As we realize, we know that the leaves for Swiss chard are bigger compared to the leaves for traditional crops. And underwater stress conditions, the take-home message is that we can still implement deficit irrigation strategies, and nutritional water productivity of traditional crops will not be affected. So it's just that I didn't bring this data, but that data is available in the papers we published from this study. The bioavailability part of micronutrients and vitamins after cooking. It is something which still need to be explored further, because what we did on those manuscripts, we were just using data which was not tested by cooking and seeing how much can be retained. What is the best method of preparing these TLVs? Is it boiling? Is it steaming? Is it frying? So that micronutrients and vitamins are available. What can be explored further is what causes this variation in nutrient concentration of TLVs. We believe that also if there were more awareness campaigns, these crops can be commercialized in South Africa, like it was done in other countries like Tanzania and Kenya. So we also need post-harvest losses and value-adding technologies. As we know, traditional crops are highly perishable. After you harvest it, and no one buys from a farmer's perspective, they will just lose value. There was a value addition technology tried between collaboration with the ARC and Nestle of the launch of Nucleus containing amaranth. So we believe that such more products should be developed in South Africa, so that will add more value to traditional crops, and they can be more marketable. Otherwise, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Nyati, for the presentation. Very interesting. And thank you for also highlighting that you obtained your PhD on this project. I know you recently completed it, so congratulations. We will move on to the next presenter, and then we'll have the discussions at the end.
Okay.
Prof. Modi, are you now here?
Yes, can you hear me? Am I muted?
I can hear you. Melvin, if you can stop sharing your screen and ask Prof. Modi to go ahead and give his presentation.
I'm trying to just make sure that I've got the right screen. Am I sharing my screen?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Why am I not happy with it? Is something blocking it?
Mm.
I'm just trying to make it a PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, go into.
Colleagues, can you see
Prof,
now? Can you see me?
Prof,
Yes.
on your screen, can you see where it says display settings? Right on top, where it says show taskbar, display settings.
Yes.
Just click on the drop down and then swap view and slide show.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now? Now you're happy?
Yes.
Okay. Colleagues, good morning. Is it morning or afternoon? I've been up and down. I apologize. Yeah, still morning. I apologize for not coming at the time that I was asked to speak. I had an emergency that I had to deal with. It's really truly an honor to have a chance to present under conditions of being relaxed and not a WRC delivery report, right, Safadza? When Gerald is watching you very closely and he wants to know clearly that you are answering his questions, and Sylvester doing the same thing. I apologize that this talk is coming at this time because it was there was a purpose for it to come after the keynote address. Having listened to the people who were talking ahead of me, I decided to slightly change my talk so that I'm not repetitive. That's one. Two, I'm trying to avoid having a dominance of my research group sharing information that is coming from the same source. So the approach that I decided to take was a sort of a philosophical one and challenging the audience about the indigenous crops. I know that the focus of my presentation is supposed to be on a drought tolerance of indigenous crops. But I thought I should ask the question, which I believe we should be asking as particularly a country and a region. The indigenous crops in agriculture, I believe that the way for them to enter the system is through water use, our better understanding of the concept of water use, as well as trying to find out if there's anything called new agriculture. Am I moving my slides? Tafadzwa?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I believe that the Water Research Commission has got an answer for us in the next few years to a decade to be able to identify these opportunities for indigenous crops and make poor people part of an agricultural system that is not only changing their lives from the perspective of food security, but also trying to address and respond to the questions that are asked by the nation with respect to poverty and hunger. So before I get into some of the areas that are related to the question that I'm putting on the table about how can we bring in indigenous crops with our better understanding of water use, science, as well as the new types of agriculture, I thought I should remind people about the big trends in the world. We can't keep talking about indigenous crops as if We are people who are living in the 18th century. The people of South Africa are supposed to be using indigenous crops because it's outside of agriculture and it's not supposed to be part of the modern day life, particularly when it comes to technology. So clearly there is evidence that the world population is increasing. The keynote speaker reminded us of that. But to me, the most important thing for us is this. In the context of indigenous crops, do we see this as a huge food marketplace? Okay. Does it spell the reality that agricultural industry is full of potential opportunities in the context of indigenous crops? The second one is the continuing ramp up in efficiency that is required generally by agriculture. Can the indigenous crops be part of this? So if you want to understand this concept, you must know that global agriculture is expected to double in the next 30 years to sustain this type of population growth. And when we do this, we need to make sure that we are not destroying the natural resources of land and water. Therefore, we have to ask ourselves whether or not through indigenous crops, we can be part of a smarter, better, and more efficient agricultural system that is going to allow us to be part of the new world. Thirdly, hyperscience is very important. Hyperscience in agriculture came and became very relevant when people realized that soil alone is not able to assist us to get the highest yield we can get. So let us get chemicals that are going to increase the nutritional content of the soil. And then after that, they realized that there's a need for us to identify chemicals that are going to defeat diseases and pests. This is growing. We've got 19 million known chemical substances today, and this number is increasing. But there is clear evidence that there are downsides to our excessive focus on these chemical compounds. The company that produces Roundup in America last year was sued over R1 billion because of evidence that their chemical is actually responsible for cancer. And this is not the story today. So is there a room for us to look at this hyperscience and convert it to be relevant to addressing the needs of people, not only from the perspective of food security, but from the perspective of a safe food? So the suggestion there is that while science is evolving furiously at a furious pace, we need to continue to see opportunities, both from the agricultural and livestock perspectives. And lastly, in terms of the changing trends, we must understand that innovation defines success. Okay, so in the context of indigenous crops, growth, efficiency, and ingestion of this science is going to be important. And this is where we have a challenge as universities. You see, once you start talking about indigenous crops, what you find as a blockage is the existing curriculum in our universities. You go to our agricultural research councils, research institutes, and when you find blockages there that say to you, this is not part of the science that is going to be consumed by the people who need answers from science, it should be something that you turn around as an advantage. And you say, we are looking at the growth, efficiency, and ingestion of new science, and indigenous crops are going to be part of us adopting new methodologies and products. And we can only do this in partnerships. And that is why the Water Research Commission is a big partner for us at UKZN in terms of achieving this goal. And of course, the relevance of Water Research Commission is that there is climate change, right? So that's why we're talking about drought tolerance. And I'm showing you a picture that I believe almost all of you have seen before and you know. And if you look at South Africa on that map, and you try to find South Africa, you will see that we belong to an area where the production, our ability to produce food can decrease by up to 50% as a result of climate change. So is there room then for indigenous crops? So the challenge that we have is what is an indigenous crop and what is drought tolerance? We have made progress through the Water Research Commission research, Water Research Commission funded research in convincing people about the correct meaning of an indigenous crop, as well as convincing literature. We've published a lot. One of the students, the postdoc fellow now, who's just presented, Chimonyo, gave some examples of the work that we've produced from our group. But the struggle continues because people still ask the question about what is an indigenous crop. And it is very easy if you speak to people and make them participate in asking and answering that question to identify these crops as grains, vegetables, and fruits. But which ones are you talking about? The reason they are traced back to be indigenous crops is because of their origin. But we must also understand that some of the crops that may not have come from South Africa as indigenous crops have become part of an indigenous culture of South Africa or an indigenous culture of Southern Africa. So we must understand that many of the crops have got varieties and species that may not have indigenously came from South Africa, but they are relatives of crops that have been domesticated elsewhere. So this illustration is an illustration of the crops of the world, the popular crops of the world. And you look at that map and you are trying to convince your students that they must do research on indigenous crops, and this is going to be useful. The important thing to do is to remind them of the crops of the world. If you look at the top part of this illustration, it has got numbers and the bottom part has got numbers, and you compare what is happening at the top and what is happening at the bottom. The top says, a century ago in 1903, commercial seed houses offered hundreds of varieties, as shown in this sampling of the 10 crops, okay? And then 80 years later, by 1983, few of those varieties were found in the National Seed Storage Laboratory, okay? So what happened? Some of the species and relatives of these crops became redundant and dated. And now we are relying on fewer of these. And when climate change comes and hits, we are very much vulnerable. This means there's an opportunity for us to go back in history and try to identify the relatives of these crops that may have characteristics, genotypic characteristics that allow them to be drought tolerant, as well as sustain the yield that may not be the highest yield, but they will be able to sustain enough yield for food security and for the crops to participate, to be part of the commercial agriculture system. The most popular ones are the cereals in terms of being the virtual part of the agricultural system, but the vegetables actually are struggling. Many of them are looked down upon as weeds. So you see people in the rural areas, when you talk to them, visiting their fields, failing to produce some of these major crops, because you see here, if you look at maize germplasm, the maize germplasm that used to be able to grow under drought-tolerant conditions and still produce yields. Generally speaking, no matter what season you have, are no longer used by people. And what they've decided to do is to listen to people who say, look at the bottom of this line and take the varieties that are now dominant and cultivated by a commercial farmer successfully. When you try that, look behind us in this illustration, you will see maize. Well, you won't see maize. Perhaps I'm the only one who can see maize here. But these people were trying to produce maize. And it is in 2020, the reason why their maize was not successful this year was because of excessive rains. And previously, they suffered from a challenge of inadequate water. So this is what happened previously. There was inadequate water. They were not able to produce maize because of climate change. So drought tolerance was a problem. Here, there's too much rain and they are not able to produce because the cultivars that they use have not been designed so that they will stand up to climate change. And they are working on food, and this is not recognized as food. They are very shy to tell people that this is food. Now, these are indigenous vegetables, and if you speak to them nicely, they will tell you how much they harvest of these, especially when there's too much rain and these plants are taking over. We need to identify the germplasm of these crops and choose the ones that can be grown under a wide range of conditions. So, as I indicated, drought tolerance, everybody knows what drought tolerance is. It reduces, it reduces the vulnerability of a crop to droughty conditions. And some plants are naturally adapted. Others have got to be assisted through germplasm improvement. Let's start off by identifying those that are naturally adapted and try to see whether or not per unit water transpired, how much biomass we produce. We don't have to match the biomass that would be produced by a cabbage if we are introducing amaranthus. We have to match that biomass in the context of sustainability and consistency of production, but much more than that, as was indicated by the previous presentations, the nutritional value of that. And once you've done that, I can tell you, as I'm wrapping up my presentations, we'll then be able to knock on the ability for these crops to get into the market. So there's a lot of work that we are doing in science, and the work has actually been done for the germplasm or the crops that are sort of commercial crops. A new research has been published to try to explain the concept of drought tolerance. So we can attract students to study indigenous crops in science. And what they will find is that the basic biochemistry and physiology of drought tolerance is going to be found, but we may actually find new ways in which these crops produce results. And if we do that, we'll actually be attracting a lot of attention in the world. So I propose that the integrated crop management system is an entry point for indigenous crops. Okay, and without reading the information that is on my slides, if we enter indigenous crops into the mainstream agriculture, we will be contributing to sustainable agriculture. Okay, and we will be introducing a kind of agriculture that can be applied to any farming system. And this requires attention to detail and continuous improvement. That's where science is going to be relevant. And if there is that kind of approach, we can then come up with a farming business that is informed by a management system that is not looking down upon indigenous crops. So modern tools and technologies are going to be relevant, and the funders, such as the Water Research Commission, are interested in funding something that is taking us forward in terms of the relevant tools and technologies that are modern, so that we are not seen to be doing water research work in the context of still keeping people backwards. Okay, so integrated crop management is a system that can be solved very easily using these types of crops and this type of genotype. If our studies about water are also studies that are linked to our responsibility and sensitivity to the environment, are we able to say that we are saving waste in this system in the context of saving water as a resource, as well as minimizing the impact of chemicals? And if we do this, yes, we'll be looking back into the future, but in my view, this is not something that is new to agriculture. What we will be doing, we will be restarting a revolution in agriculture where we now have a reason to promote biodiversity and at the same time trying to make agriculture part of commercialization through indigenous crops. And therefore, we need to clearly define our aims and objectives, okay? We can still provide adequate supply of food in an efficient manner. We can have a minimum consumption of non-renewables using this kind of system, and we can safeguard the quality of our soil, our water, and the air through a biodiverse kind of agriculture. And this requires some principles that some speakers have already talked about. Crop rotation is one of those major principles, because through crop rotation, you can ensure effective nutrient uptake. And if you ensure effective nutrient uptake, you're also ensuring effective water use by your crop, okay? Soil protection is a very important thing. And many of these crops have been shown through research that through an intercropping system, they can actually also protect the soil, and their ability to utilize water and nutrients does protect the soil. And crop nutrition is very important. Is it possible that there will be very little nutrient inputs that are required for indigenous crops? The answer is yes. We've published research that shows that already. So if we do this through regular analysis, we can now bring on board people who are coming from different disciplines to answer questions not only about crop nutrition, but also about environmental resource protection. Crop rotation I've already talked about. So what is important is for us to measure this system of agriculture and as far as its impacts and outcomes. Clearly, if you're not talking to a scientist and you're talking to somebody who wants to fund your research using government funds, they're going to ask you, what are your experiments going to show that I can use in my policy decisions? Here are some examples of what indigenous crops, because of being drought tolerant and efficient in using nutrients and other resources, can do. If you use ICM or integrated crop management system, a 5 to 15% yield reduction is something that is an indicator of an agricultural system where agriculture is not using high levels of resources. But the question is, if you are using experimentation, you can show that 5% reduction in yields can actually be something that has no economic effect in terms of your ability to produce sustainably. Okay, so we are not denying that there will be a decrease in yield, but the quality of the produce is going to be maintained. The variable costs are going to be reduced by 20 to 30%. The gross margins and pesticides inputs and so on are going to be improved. What is it that you are trying to do? You are trying to introduce indigenous crops into the system, and you have to be able to measure their impact. Now, it's not only about crop scientists. It's also about agricultural economics. It's about a new farmer that we want to introduce through using indigenous crops. So the Water Research Commission, in my view, and my experience of many years of working with them, they actually do support a design of an appropriate kind of ICM, okay? Continuous learning and improvement is a basic approach that they support. And this is what we've been using in our research system, where we have to clearly define our objectives. Yes, the core is about water use efficiency, drought tolerance. We take decisions, the right decisions, we measure the action of these decisions, and we continue to evaluate. If we continue to do this and make it part of our science that is broad-based and not just focused on one item, with a view to coming up with a revolution of agriculture through edu-science and edu-indigenous, we can even improve the kind of curriculum that we have that speaks to our ability to bring on board a large majority of poor people who believe that the resources, the genetic resources that they have at hand are not useful. And here you are, you can do all sorts of things in order to make sure that these crops are part of the system, and you identify evolution and integrated farming systems that will make them to be happy to be part of the science of today. So in closing, I am recommending that we need some global trends in agriculture and agribusiness to be understood, and we then need to work together and not separately or in silos to drive change, okay? And the change must not just be about the basic science of indigenous crops, a basic science of water use efficiency, a basic science of drought tolerance. It must be a science that is going to attract competition for funding and competition for the impact of research. If the Water Research Commission has funded my research, am I able to say, I've actually created a market-driven agriculture through indigenous crops, shifting away from production-driven agriculture, but to the one that is market-driven, and yet the commodity of water is used very efficiently. Have I contributed, have I assisted the Water Research Commission to be part of globalization? Okay, have I allowed the government to have regulations and policy change that will support the production of indigenous crops, not only as food, but also as industrial crops, okay? Have I responded to the consumer demands in terms of the consistency, safety, convenience, choice of reliability, amount of germplasm that is sitting there? And have I contributed to new technologies? There's a lot of biotechnology research that is sitting there. We've started the precision farming, the information management. You know, all of these three sciences can be combined and they can assist decisions that are made by funders, by government, as well as changing the curriculum. And so above all, the environmental management, you can make people participate in efforts to make sure that climate change and globalization are not having the negative impact that they could have if their science, their indigenous science, was not part of the debate. So I thought I should slightly change my topic. That's my last slide. I thought I should slightly change my topic and infuse the concept of drought tolerance of indigenous crops in a bigger picture of their usefulness in agriculture and opportunities that we can get through science and indigenous knowledge to take them forward, while the Water Research Commission continues to support us in a bigger picture kind of perspective that is not just the basic results, but how do you change policy and protect the environment. Thanks a lot. Have I lost people?
No, you have not. They do not have access to their microphones.
I hope I was not speaking to one slide all the time.
No, they were moving.
Okay.
So thanks very much, Prof, for that very informative presentation, which basically tied in what Desigen started off with and what Vimbai and Melvin then added on in terms of the role and potential of underutilized crops, not just for food and nutrition security, but also thinking of them in the context of broader socioeconomic development and how we can leverage on the research that has been done so far to propel this crops. So we're going to have a discussion at the end of the session. I'll now invite the next and last speaker to present, and after that, we'll then have our discussion session. If people have any comments or questions for the speaker, please post them on the Q&A. And then after we have the last presentation, we'll ask the speakers to address the questions. Thank you, Prof. And Richard, if you are there, please go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, there you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Super, thank you. All right, so my name is Richard. I'm part of the Center for Water Resources Research at UKZN. I'm here to talk to you about a new WRC funded project on the water use of indigenous root and tuber crops. All right, as you can see from today's proceedings, the WRC has funded more than 2.5 decades of research on traditional and indigenous food crops, with 3 main research themes being drought and heat tolerance, water use and nutritional value, as well as nutritional water productivity. And the purpose of today's webinar, just to recap, is to showcase previous and ongoing research projects that highlight challenges, opportunities, research gaps, and progress. The previous speakers have covered 4 of the WRC-funded projects, and I'm here to talk about a project that only recently started last year. It's a 4-year project, as I said, looking at the water use of root and tubers. And there's another project that is also ongoing at the university, which will be completed next year. So back in 2016, Professors Modi and Mabadi drew up a draft research agenda to guide future research funding related to underutilized crops. They reviewed the literature on past and current research and also identified challenges and opportunities along the value chain. The research identified 13 priority crops based on drought and heat tolerance, as well as the nutritional value of these crops. However, they also identified significant gaps in knowledge on crop production, specifically related to the lack of seed systems, crop improvements, crop agronomy, as well as post-harvest handling and storage and agro-processing. As Desigan and other speakers have mentioned, we must remember that South Africa is a water-scarce country, where 60% of our land surface is classified as arid to semi-arid, with the remaining being classified as humid to subhumid. So if we look at our rainfall distribution, all right, we clearly see there's a very sharp gradient moving from east to west, where the western parts of our country certainly cannot promote rain-fed crop production. If we look at data from the South African Weather Service, which shows the interannual variability in rainfall, you can see how our rainfall goes through cycles called cyclicity, where we have higher periods of higher rainfall followed by periods of lower rainfall, and the cycle repeats. Based on a 30-year period from 1981 to 2000, our average annual rainfall is around 500 millimeters, which is about half the world's average, making South Africa the 30th driest country in the world, which is characterized by low and highly variable rainfall, yet 90% of our crop production is rain-fed. And you can see what we have to deal with if you look at the very low annual rainfalls in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s. Those are obviously our severe droughts, and obviously the very, the most recent drought being 2015, 2016, that's obviously still very fresh in our minds. If you look at this diagram, it shows that 60% of the country receives less than 500 millimeters of annual rainfall, and put another way, only 2% of the country receives 1,000 or more millimeters, being the world average. So we are indeed a water scarce country. So not only does low and irregular rainfall affect small-scale farmers, this being the dominant factor affecting crop production, which cannot easily be improved with irrigation, small-scale farmers have to deal with marginal and less fertile soils. They have limited access to information, in particular production guidelines, which means that they are unable to make informed decisions. This all culminates in low and unreliable yields, which obviously will impact on their food and nutrition security. And they have limited access to markets, and all the previous speakers have touched on this. So as scientists, how can we help farmers? Firstly, we need to fully understand their vulnerability, even to help revive and strengthen indigenous knowledge systems, as well as producing knowledge that we believe benefits both society and the economy. We need to find crops that can enable farmers to meet certain challenges. We need crops that are resilient to climate risks, in other words, drought and heat tolerance, crops that produce reasonable yields with less water, in other words, they're more water use efficient, crops that improve agrobiodiversity and dietary diversity, as well as promote the development of new value chains. For example, maybe the role cassava can play in bioethanol production. And we believe that root and tubers may be part of the solution. So how do we classify root and tubers? As you can see from the table, giving examples such as cassava, potato, sweet potato, taro, tanya, and yam. Although these crops all belong to different botanical families, they all produce underground food, subterranean food, in the form of a root or a tuber. So that's what they all have in common. As has been pointed out by Prof. Modi, none are truly indigenous to South Africa, but they certainly have become indigenized over time, with the latter two, tanya and yam, being certainly still underutilized in South Africa. So why should farmers, in particular rural farmers, grow root and tuber crops? All right, we call these crops the drought insurance crops, simply because of their natural or improved drought tolerance. We believe they require fewer external inputs for production, as was highlighted by Melvin, and we believe they produce reasonable yields where other crops cannot. And they'll obviously also reduce our dominance on cereal-based cropping systems, and hopefully revive agricultural production, particularly in rural areas, and alleviate poverty. And some even have the potential to become commercialized and certainly industrialized. So besides the potential to alleviate poverty and hunger, promoting drought tolerance and nutrient-dense root and tubers can address other sustainable development goals. For example, number 8, which is stimulating sustainable economic growth and employment. And this can be done obviously through the expansion of agriculture, particularly in rural areas, as well as the job employment that comes with that. So where in the country should poverty alleviation occur first? If you look at this map and you look at the areas in red, you can see that the expansion of agriculture through the production of underutilized crops can certainly help communities in the KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape provinces, but it's not going to help those in the Northern Cape where rainfed production of crops is obviously unviable. Although root and tubers exhibit vast potential, they remain mostly underutilized. And obviously, the question here is why. This is mainly due to the lack of research that has been focused on them in the past. Historically, we all know that more attention has been given to the cereals, and hopefully from today's proceedings, you can see that this imbalance is certainly being addressed by the Water Research Commission. Other factors that hinder the adoption of root and tuber crops is the lack of production guidelines, which limits their adoption, and obviously the upscaling of production from small scale to large scale. There's a lack of detailed physiological information, which for us scientists means that we cannot parameterize our crop models, and we cannot use those crop models to generate information and knowledge. There's an absence of well-developed and supported value chains, and for example, there's no seed systems for root and tubers, which means that value chains will remain rudimentary until this can be addressed. So it should be clear that investment in research is certainly key for the development of sustainable value chains. And with this in mind, the Water Research Commission has funded a 4-year project on root and tuber, on the water use of root and tuber crops, with Professor Tafatswa Mabaudi and myself as the principal investigators. We've obviously got a number of colleagues who we can approach for help and support and advice. And in terms of capacity building, we had an honors student work on the project last year, as well as a PhD student, and an MSc student joined us this year. And we have a postdoc student that works for us part-time, and you've met that student, it's Dr. Chimonyo. So the overall aim of the root and tuber crop project is to contribute to the existing knowledge base and to focus our attention on where little or conflicting information exists. And the main aim is obviously to promote the sustainable production of root and tubers. We've recently conducted a detailed literature review where we focused on crop water use and yield and what we know about nutritional and health benefits of these crops, in order to identify the major gaps in knowledge, which we plan to address through field work, in particular the measurement of crop water use, yield, and nutrient content. And this will hopefully help us to improve the existing knowledge on crop and nutritional water productivity, and allow us to model the water use and yield of these crops, which we can then use to help develop production guidelines and even land suitability maps. So the overall purpose of the literature review, as I mentioned, was to identify existing knowledge gaps and to help focus the project's research efforts. But more specifically, as you can see from the table, we wanted to identify crops that have the potential to be drought tolerant, such as cassava, water use efficient, such as sweet potato, and crops that are nutrient dense, such as taro, and that's not shown in the table. So our main findings on crop water use and water productivity, there's definitely a disproportionate amount of attention that has been given to some root and tubers. For example, most of the attention given to cassava, at least for Tania. When compared to cereal crops, we know that research on crop water use and water productivity is a lot scarce, and the amount of water required for successful crop production is unclear. There's a lack of credible information, which will certainly limit the promotion and the adoption of root and tubers. We know that drought avoidance mechanisms have a high yield penalty. For example, yam, when it becomes water stressed, will delay its tuber initiation and obviously reduce the final yield. And the literature review also identified taro and sweet potato as being priority crops. So let's focus a little bit of attention on these two. So for taro, the literature review showed that there's a high water requirement ranging from 1,750 to 2,500 millimeters of water, which is high relative to other root and tubers. We believe this is probably due to genotype differences. We have an upland and a lowland taro, and the upland taro definitely uses less water than the lowland taro. And within the upland land races, we have an Edo type, which is definitely more drought tolerant than the Dashins. So our field work will initially focus on Edos. We know that taro is superior in terms of its nutritional value compared to other root and tubers, particularly with respect to its high protein digestibility and its mineral composition. Regarding sweet potato, it also has a large range in optimum water requirements, but it does exhibit moderate drought stress, except in the few weeks after planting. In terms of its nutrient content, as Melvin has also highlighted, it is rich in calcium and certain antioxidants and even iron. There are two types, a staple type, which is identified by its white flesh, and the dessert type, which is identified by its orange flesh, which has higher sugar and beta-carotene content, and it can definitely play a role in reducing vitamin A deficiency in children, particularly in Africa, as being highlighted in many countries, even Uganda did a study involving 10,000 children. So again, the orange flesh will be the focus of our fieldwork initially. So the nutritional value of taro has provided farmers in the Mbulu district with a unique opportunity where they market their produce to retail, large supermarkets. And obviously this has had an increase in demand for this particular crop. In terms of other value chains and opportunities, we believe that maybe, if cassava can play a role in bioethanol production. There are two streams of plant breeding with regard to cassava, for an edible version and an industrial version. So the industrial cassava is bred for its high starch content, which you can see from the figures is certainly higher than other root and tubers, meaning that its bioethanol yield potential is even greater than that of sugarcane. So moving forward, our research focus, we're going to concentrate on upland taro and obviously the orange fleshed sweet potato, based on the outcome of the literature review, and knowing that these crops can certainly, hopefully, create new value chains. We know that these crops should play important roles in the poverty, unemployment, and inequality nexus, as well as the water, food, nutrition, health nexus, as Wimbai highlighted. Our field-based research, as I said, will focus on plantaira and orange flesh sweet potato. We know that these plants are big, they're not easily grown in greenhouses, so we require controlled conditions where we can conduct reliable physiological studies with the goal of better understanding crop water use and yield, and more importantly, the link between the environment and nutrient content. With that, I'd like to just say thank you. And if we don't get a chance to answer any of your questions, please feel free to email me, especially obviously regarding this new project, which I wanted to highlight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm worried that we have gone over time by 15 minutes so far. Tobile, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here, Prof.
Okay. Do we still have time to invite questions from the participants, if any?
Yes, we can. If there are people that want to ask questions, they can raise their hands and we can see who can answer that. So they can just raise their hands and I'll give them permission.
Okay, thanks very much.
Speak.
So, colleagues, you've heard from Tobile. If there is anyone with any question for any one of our panelists, please raise your hand and Tobile will give you the space to ask your question.
I see we have Ashwin and Sue, so I've given Ashwin a permission to speak. Just unmute yourself, Ashwin.
Tobile, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. You can go ahead.
All right. Thanks. It's not a question. I think just to yourselves and to Tafadzwa, I found this a most heartening webinar session. I think it ties in very crucially to a lot of what I'll call the African agenda, but particularly in South Africa, where our focus has been largely on commercial crops propagated largely from Western countries that have kind of production value rather than, as Prof. Modi said, also the market and traditional value. It gives emphasis to indigenous knowledge systems and the upscaling of indigenous knowledge systems. So I'm very heartened by this. And this is an area of research that has been long, it's been a long time coming. So I think that's on the agricultural side. On the water side, I think that nexus between these two is also very powerful here, particularly in relation to irrigated agriculture, which is one of the biggest water users in the country. And that indirect spin-off is also on the energy requirements for irrigated agriculture, where if one grows more resilient crops that are suited to our kind of climatic regimes here, I think it holds a lot of promise for the way we reimagine our cold water resources management in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. That's just my comment from what it's worth. These were very valuable presentations, and thanks, and also congratulations to the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin, for the comments. The next question, please.
We have Sue. Sue, I've unmuted. You can speak now. Sue Walker, Prof. Sue.
Unmute. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I will also want to thank everybody who's presented today. And maybe my question was a bit before Richard started explaining, but I was a little bit worried that some of the climate aspects had been forgotten. And that is because if we think about climate change, then we know that there's going to be an increase in the extremes. And I think Prof. Modi did touch on that, but I think that has to be brought into our understanding of the value chains. And so we can try to increase the resilience and introduce the indigenous crops, but then there can be these sudden extreme events. And so we have to really look at it from that point of view as well. And so that's why I wanted to just talk about the fact that we do know, or the other people who are working on indigenous crops across the world know about what the requirements are for those crops for temperature or resistant to frost, etc. And so we really have to go and look for some of that information and then be able to build in some advisories so that we can really be able to help the farmers to know what to do when. And so, yes, thank you very much to everyone, and it was very interesting.
Thank you, Prof. Sue. I see we have Nafisa.
Nafisa, are you unmuted? You can speak.
Yes, thanks to all presenters for these informative research outputs. So my question is, how does this whole research regarding the traditional crops, what are the linkages or overlapping research areas that feeds into the Umgeni Resilience Project? So maybe it's a question to Tafatswa or any other presenters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nafisa. Is there any one of the presenters who would like to answer Nafisa's question?
Sorry, I'm not raising my hand. I apologize to the person who's giving house rules. But maybe I should start, Tafadzwa. I think it's a fair question, but my worry is that perhaps other people don't understand what she means by Umgeni Resilience Project. I don't know whether you think it would be a good idea to help the audience about what that means.
Yes,
before we
I think that would help with context.
Yes, I'm just asking you to just quickly assist the audience in terms of what it means. What is she talking about Umgeni Resilience Project? Then I can answer the question.
Okay, so the Umgeni Resilience Project, it's a climate change adaptation project that is funded by the Global Adaptation Fund through the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and is partly led by University of KwaZulu-Natal. The aim of the project is to build resilience among small-scale farmers in KwaZulu-Natal to the impacts of climate change. So that is the project that Nafisa was referring to as the URP. You can go ahead, Prof.
Okay. So Nafisa, you know, the broad aim of the Umgeni Resilience Project is not just about the increased production of food by people. It's aimed at making sure that there's an integrated system that protects people from the vulnerabilities of global warming and climate change. And we are in a system of or a project that is targeting the rural poor people. So if through this project, and particularly perhaps if I can talk directly about these presentations, if you think about a poor person in the rural areas who had given up on agriculture because they say they don't have enough land, they say that they don't have water for irrigation, they say that they don't have knowledge, they don't have resources. And you go to those people with a small area of land that is in front of their house or their hut, and you say to them, I can explain how you can utilize this small area of land to produce crops that will have less requirement for expensive resources. I can tell you that you've got knowledge that may not be in the books to be able to produce these crops And part of that knowledge is part of your culture. And what we do then is we end up learning from these people because they are the ones who identify some of the crops that Richard has talked about, for example. They start identifying them and they wonder whether or not they are important crops. And suddenly we change the culture of the people and make it part of the modern culture. The example of Amadumbe now being available at Pick and Pay, it's something that people were beginning to throw away because there is potato. Amadumbe is for poor people. Now we brought Amadumbe into the market. You see, it's changing the lives of the people. But if you produce Amadumbe, what impact do you have on the utilization of water resources or resistance to extremes of climate change? We have to answer that through science. What do you have to contribute in terms of the nutritional value of the crop and the economic value of the crop? We have to answer that through science. So to a certain extent, I'm trying to answer your question about why and how is it relevant. But the whole issue about environment protection is relevant as well, because these crops, if you grow them, there's evidence that the damage that is caused by many people in the rural areas will try to mimic what a commercial farmer is doing on a large farm. Ends up damaging the land. You think that you can be a big scale, large scale maize producer and you try to do things that are not supposed to be done and you destroy the environment. But the large scale farmer has got ways of protecting that land and they're using the facilities that can do that. You are not able to do that. So try to identify crops that will protect the environment and save water.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you very much, Nafisa. I will perhaps entertain one last question for our speakers before we bring the discussion to an end. Any last question?
Nothing from my side, Prof.
Okay. Thank you very much. With that, I would like to thank our speakers for today, Wimbai, Melvin, Richard, Prof. Modi, and Desigen, who gave us the opening remarks today. So the subject of underutilized crops has been emerging or has taken center stage, mostly driven from the climate change perspective that Prof. Su was referring to, and the need to urgently adapt to climate change and to identify suitable crops that can fit into especially dry environments that are going to become drier and hotter, and also crops that fit into what we call marginal environments where it is hard to produce most of the other existing major crops, and as well as to address gaps in nutrition from a nutrient density perspective. So the target has been the smallholder farmers, as Prof. Modi mentioned, because they practice a type of agriculture that is really ideal for these crops. And they are also residing in the areas where a lot of these crops ideally fit. So the purpose of today's discussion was to share the trajectory of work that has been done so far on these crops through Water Research Commission funding, and to showcase where the state of knowledge is and the future direction, which is the project that Richard was presenting on the water use of root and tuber crops. So we started off from broadly looking at all the underutilized crops. Then we moved to prioritize a few. From there, we looked at cereal and legume food crops. We've looked at the leafy vegetable crops. And at this stage, we are now looking at the root and tuber crops, which is the project that has just started and is being led by Richard Coons. So colleagues, we hope that you found the presentations informative. And if you have any questions after this, or you need any of the presenters' contacts, please feel free to contact the Water Research Commission for the details of the speakers. They will share them with you. And I think Tobile will also share the presentations with all participants today. with that, I thank you all, and I'll hand back to Tobile and the Water Research Commission to end the proceedings.
Thanks, Prof. I think we can close the meeting unless maybe Lakson wants to say something. Lakson, is there anything you want to add? Lakson?
Lakson's probably muted there, Tobile.
Yes, I can see that. Lakson, you're not muted. You can just speak.
Yeah, I think maybe Lakson is having sound challenges.
Some sound challenges, but I think we are done, Prof. You've closed the meeting very well, so I think we can end now. I will send the presentation to everybody. I'll just request the speakers once again to send me all their presentations, and I will share with them, with everyone. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you very much, Tobile.